She's nothing but a disappointment. My mother's voice rang through the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. The kind of silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of strangers holding their breath, unsure whether to look away or keep watching. I didn't flinch. I stood at the respondent's table in the old provincial courthouse in Lanark County, Ontario, hands clasped in front of me, eyes fixed on the oak paneling behind the judge's bench. My father sat beside my mother, arms folded tight across his chest, jaw set hard like he'd rehearsed this moment in his head 100 times. Behind us, the gallery whispered. I caught a woman in the second row pressing her hand to her mouth, but I stayed quiet. Then the judge leaned forward slowly, removed his reading glasses, and looked past me toward my parents' lawyer. "Counsel," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Are you genuinely unaware of who this woman is?" The lawyer's pen stopped moving. My parents' faces lost all color. But that moment didn't appear out of nothing. It started 5 months earlier, the day I drove back to a place I had promised myself I would never see again. I hadn't set foot in Lanark County in nearly 7 years. Small towns in eastern Ontario have long memories. The streets change slowly. The same United Church still stood at the corner of Drummond and Foster. The same hardware store still had a faded Canadian Tire sign propped in the window. And the same Tim Hortons on the edge of town still smelled like double-doubles and stale Timbits by mid-afternoon. The only thing different was me. I parked my truck outside the Tim Hortons on a Tuesday morning in late September. The air had that crisp bite to it, the kind that tells you summer packed up overnight and left without saying goodbye. Maple trees along the main road were already turning, red and gold against a pale sky. A couple of retired farmers sat inside by the window, nursing coffees the way they probably had every morning for 20 years. One of them was Mr. Alderman. He used to run the grain elevator outside town when I was a girl. He must have been close to 80 now. He looked out the window, squinted through the glass, and his eyebrows lifted. He knew my face. Small towns never forget. I stepped inside. The bell above the door gave a quiet chime. Every head turned. It felt like walking into a photograph someone had taken a decade ago and finding out nothing in the frame had moved. The woman behind the counter, Gail, blinked twice before she said my name. Maren Aldridge. I smiled politely. "Morning, Gail." "Well," she said softly. "Didn't figure we'd see you back here." Neither did I. I took a seat at the counter. A medium dark roast appeared without me ordering. In towns like this, people remember how you take your coffee. Black, no sugar. Gail poured it slowly and studied my face the way someone flips through an old photo album, comparing the memory to what's in front of them. "You here to visit your folks?" she asked carefully. I took a sip. It tasted exactly the way it had 7 years ago. "Something like that," I said. The truth was a good deal more complicated. I hadn't spoken to my parents in almost 4 years. Our last conversation ended with my father telling me I was wasting my life chasing nonsense, and my mother agreeing with a silence that felt louder than any words. After that, I packed a bag, climbed into my truck before sunrise, and drove south toward Ottawa without leaving a note or a forwarding address. For a long time, that silence between us felt like relief. Until the phone call came. 3 weeks before I returned to Lanark County, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I was sitting in my apartment in Ottawa at the time, sorting through paperwork at my kitchen table. When I answered, a gentle voice said, "Maren, it's Reverend Mackey." I hadn't heard that name in years. He had been the minister at the Presbyterian church my family attended when I was growing up. "How are you, Reverend?" I asked. There was a pause. Then he sighed softly. "I'm afraid I'm calling with difficult news, Maren. Your grandmother passed away last night." The words sat in my chest like a stone. Grandma Elise had been the only person in my family who never looked at me like I was a mistake. She used to say, "You don't have to stay anywhere you aren't seen, sweetheart, not even here." I swallowed. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said quietly. "There's something else," the Reverend added. He explained that my grandmother had left behind a will. According to that will, she had left me her house and a small parcel of land on a concession road outside town. I stared at the wall for a long time after that call ended. Grandma's farmhouse. The one with the sugar maple in the front yard that turned the color of fire every October. The one place in Lanark County where I had ever felt like I belonged. I didn't want the property for its value. But I knew one thing with certainty. If my parents found out about that will, there would be trouble. 2 days after I arrived in town, the trouble showed up. I was sitting on the porch of my grandmother's house, watching the wind comb through the stubble fields, when a car turned into the gravel lane. My father's old Ford pickup. He stepped out first. My mother followed. Neither of them waved. They walked toward the porch slowly, like they were approaching someone they didn't quite recognize. My father looked around the yard with a scowl. "So," he said, "you came back for the property." I kept my voice even. "It's not about property." My mother shook her head bitterly. "You vanish for years. Then the moment there's a house involved, you appear." I stood up from the porch chair. "I came because Grandma wanted me here." "That's convenient," my father said. "Because we were the ones looking after her." The argument lasted less than 5 minutes. My father ended it with a sentence I'll carry for the rest of my life. "If you had a shred of decency, you'd sign that house over to us." I didn't answer. I just watched them walk back to the truck. 4 days later, a process server knocked on the farmhouse door and handed me a thick envelope. Inside were court documents. My parents were contesting the will, claiming undue influence, and arguing that the estate should pass to them as next of kin, who had maintained the family relationship. And just like that, the family I had spent years putting distance between myself and was pulling me into a courtroom. But what they didn't understand was that silence is not the same as emptiness. Sometimes the quietest people have been carrying the heaviest things. The first thing you learn about a small town is that news moves faster than fact. By the time I walked into Tim Hortons the morning after the process server came, half the county already had a version of the story. They just didn't have the details. And in a place like Lanark County, details have never stopped anyone from forming an opinion. The bell above the door chimed. Conversations paused. Gail was behind the counter again, wiping the same mug she'd probably wiped a dozen times already. She looked up at me with a sympathetic tilt of her head. "Heard about it," she said quietly. Of course she had. I slid onto the same stool as the day before. "Morning, Gail." She poured my coffee without asking. "You going to fight it?" she asked gently. I wrapped both hands around the warm cup. "I'm going to show up," I said. That was the most honest answer I could give. Across the shop, Mr. Alderman pretended to read the Ottawa Citizen while listening with one ear turned our way. It reminded me of something my grandmother used to say. In a small town, privacy is just good manners. I sipped my coffee and looked out the window toward the courthouse across the road. The same courthouse where my parents had decided to settle this. Not at a kitchen table, not over the phone, in front of a judge and a gallery full of neighbors. That told me everything I needed to know about how deep their resentment ran. The hearing was scheduled 3 weeks later. 3 weeks is a long time when you're waiting for something you dread. I spent most of those days working on my grandmother's house. The screen door needed a new hinge. The porch steps had gone soft. The sugar maple in the front yard hadn't been pruned in years. Working with my hands kept my thoughts steady. It also kept the gossip manageable. Still, people stopped by. Not to help, mostly to have a look. Old Mrs. Fenton from the next concession walked up one afternoon with a casserole dish and curiosity all over her face. "Heard your parents are taking you to court," she said while handing me the dish. "That's what the papers say," I replied. She sighed the way older women do when they're about to share a strong opinion. "Families used to settle things without lawyers," she said. "Now everyone needs a judge to tell them who's right." She wasn't wrong. But I didn't argue. A few days before the hearing, I met the lawyer representing my parents. His name was Gordon Fawcett. He was exactly the kind of lawyer you'd expect in a county courthouse. Polished shoes, silver hair, confident smile, the kind of man who had won more small-town cases than he'd lost. He stopped me outside the courthouse steps one afternoon. "Miss Aldridge," he said, extending his hand. I shook it. "Mr. Fawcett." He looked me over carefully. Not rudely, more like a mechanic examining an engine he hasn't seen before. "I represent your parents," he said. "Though I expect you know that." "I do." He nodded. "I'm sure you also understand their position. Your grandmother's estate represents a meaningful asset for them. They're on a fixed income. CPP and OAS only stretch so far." There it was. The argument. I kept my voice calm. "My grandmother left a will." "Yes," he said. "And wills can be contested when the circumstances raise questions." He paused. "If you'd prefer to avoid legal costs, we could resolve this quietly." "What kind of resolution?" He smiled politely. "Transfer the property to your parents." I almost laughed. Instead, I said the same thing I had told Gail. "I'll show up in court." His smile tightened just slightly. Well, he said, adjusting his tie. I suppose we'll see what the judge decides. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table in my grandmother's house with the will spread out in front of me. The document was simple. Grandma Elise had never been a complicated woman. The farmhouse and 1.5 hectares of land were left to me. But attached to the will was a note, not a legal clause, just something she had written in her careful handwriting. Maren, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I know your parents don't understand you the way I do, but I always believed you were braver than anyone in this family ever gave you credit for. Don't let them tell you who you are. I folded the note slowly. Grandma had always seen through the noise. She knew exactly how this town and my parents would judge me. The day before the hearing, my parents came to the farmhouse again. I saw the Ford turning into the lane just past noon. I stepped outside before they reached the porch. My father didn't bother with greetings. Last chance, he said. For what? To do the right thing. My mother crossed her arms. You've always been stubborn, Maren, even as a child. I didn't respond. My father gestured toward the house. This place belongs to the family. It does, I said quietly. And I'm part of this family. My mother scoffed. You stopped being part of this family the day you drove off. That sentence hung in the cold September air like smoke that wouldn't clear. None of us spoke for a long moment. Finally, my father shook his head. Tomorrow's going to be humiliating for you, he said. I met his eyes calmly. We'll see. They drove away. I stood in the lane watching the dust settle behind the truck. Not angry, not afraid, just tired. The morning of the hearing arrived colder than the rest of the week. Late October wind rattled the flag outside the courthouse as I climbed the stone steps. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of old wood and floor wax. The courtroom doors were already propped open. People from town had come to watch. Not because they cared about estates law, because family drama has always been the most reliable entertainment in a small community. My parents were seated at the front beside their lawyer. My mother avoided looking at me. My father stared straight ahead. I took my seat at the opposite table. No lawyer beside me. Just a folder of documents and a quiet mind. Mr. Fawcett glanced at me and raised his eyebrows. You're self-represented? He asked softly. Yes. He gave a polite chuckle. Well, that's brave. Maybe he thought it was foolish. Maybe it was. But I had learned something over the years. When the truth is simple, it doesn't always need expensive words around it. The clerk called the room to order. The judge walked in, and the matter of Aldridge v. Aldridge officially began. None of us knew it yet, but before that day was over, every person in that gallery would look at my parents differently. The judge's name was Robert Beaulieu, a lean man in his late 60s with silver hair and the kind of steady eyes you see on someone who has listened to every version of human conflict and stopped being surprised a long time ago. He didn't look eager to be anyone's referee. He looked like he'd rather be at his cottage on the Rideau with a mug of tea and a crossword puzzle. When he sat down, he didn't make a show of it. He nodded once to the clerk, arranged the papers in front of him, and said, "All right, let's begin." The courtroom settled. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead. Someone near the back coughed into their sleeve. Judge Beaulieu looked at my parents first. "Mr. and Mrs. Aldridge," he said. "You are contesting the will of the late Elise Aldridge. Counsel, please proceed." Gordon Fawcett stood smoothly, buttoned his suit jacket, and approached the front of the room like a man about to deliver a lecture he had given many times before. "Your Honor," he began, "this is a painful matter for my clients. They have lived in this community for decades. They cared for Mrs. Elise Aldridge in her final years. The property in question has long been understood as a family home, one that should remain with the parents who maintained a relationship with the deceased and fulfilled their familial obligations." He paused, turning slightly, so his words reached the gallery. "Meanwhile, the respondent," he said, nodding toward me, "has been absent for years. She has not contributed to the upkeep of the property. She has not participated in family life. She returned only after Mrs. Aldridge passed, when there was something to gain." My stomach stayed steady. I had heard versions of that accusation my entire life. He continued, "We ask the court to recognize the inequity of awarding this estate to someone who has, in effect, abandoned her family." Politely worded, but it carried the same sharp edge as a slap. Judge Beaulieu listened without interrupting. His pen moved slowly across a notepad. When Fawcett finished, the judge looked at my parents. "Mrs. Aldridge," he said, "do you wish to address the court?" My mother stood like she had been waiting years for this exact moment. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, voice tight. She faced the judge, but her eyes kept darting toward me like I was a stain she couldn't scrub out of the fabric. "I raised her," my mother said. "I fed her. I kept clothes on her back. I did everything a mother is supposed to do. And what did I get?" She left. She walked out like we meant nothing. My father nodded beside her, jaw working. My mother's voice rose. Not out of strength, out of desperation. "She didn't call," she said. "She didn't come for Christmas. She didn't even come when her grandmother got sick. And now she wants to take the house? After everything we did?" Judge Beaulieu raised a hand slightly, not to silence her, just to slow the pace. "I understand you're upset," he said. But my mother was beyond calm. She turned her head toward me, and something in her face hardened, like the last thin layer of tenderness had been scraped away and replaced by bitterness. And then she said it. "She's nothing but a disappointment. Not misguided, not confused. A disappointment." The word landed in the room and didn't move, like a glass dropped on a hardwood floor. For a moment, nobody spoke. I heard a chair creak. A soft intake of breath. The shuffling of someone's boots. Judge Beaulieu's gaze shifted from my mother to me. He studied my face the way a person studies a photograph they don't fully understand. I kept my eyes forward. I didn't flinch. I didn't shake my head. I didn't argue. I stayed silent, because if I responded, the room would become a battle of emotions, hers against mine. And my mother had been rehearsing that battle for years. Judge Beaulieu cleared his throat gently. "Mr. Aldridge," he said to my father, "do you wish to add anything?" My father stood more slowly, as if the act of rising was itself a statement. "She always wanted to do things her own way," he said. "Never listened. We tried to guide her. She thought she knew better. Then she left us to handle everything on our own. We're not young anymore, Your Honor." That part was true. They weren't young. But age didn't make their cruelty any softer. Fawcett stepped in again, sensing momentum. "Your Honor, my clients live on a fixed pension. Property taxes in this county have risen sharply. Medical expenses continue to climb. The home represents stability for them." Judge Beaulieu nodded slowly. "I'm aware of those realities," he said. Then he looked at me. "Miss Aldridge," he said, "you are self-represented. You may respond." Every head in the room turned my way again. I stood. My palms were dry. My heartbeat was steady. Not because I didn't feel anything, but because I had learned to carry feeling without letting it spill everywhere. "Yes, Your Honor." I didn't look at my parents. I looked at the judge. "My grandmother wrote her will clearly," I said. "I have a copy here. I also have documentation of our relationship and records, showing I stayed in contact when I could." Fawcett gave a small, doubtful smile. "In contact," he echoed softly, as though it were a joke. I opened my folder and pulled out the papers I had prepared. Letters. A few printed emails. A record of e-transfers I had sent to my grandmother over the years through her credit union account. Judge Beaulieu leaned forward slightly. "Bring those to the clerk," he said. I walked the papers up, handed them over, and returned to my seat. No drama, no speeches about being misunderstood, just paper and truth. The judge began reading through the documents carefully. The courtroom fell into a quiet heavier than before. Fawcett shifted his weight. My mother stared at the judge like she could will him to decide faster. My father's hands tightened on the armrests of his chair. Judge Beaulieu paused on one page longer than the others. His expression barely changed, just a slight tightening around his eyes. Then he looked up, first at the folder, then at me, and for the first time that morning, his gaze stayed on me for more than a second, like he was noticing something the rest of the room had missed. He set his pen down. "Counsel Fawcett," he said. "Voice even. Approach." Fawcett stepped forward confidently at first, but I saw the brief flicker of uncertainty when the judge spoke. "Are you genuinely unaware of who this woman is?" The room didn't move. Fawcett stood at the front of the courtroom with one hand resting on the edge of the table. A moment earlier, he had looked like a man guiding a straightforward case toward its conclusion. Now his posture shifted. His shoulders tightened. His smile disappeared. For the first time that morning, he looked at me directly. Not the quick glance he had given before. A longer look. The kind someone gives when they suddenly realize they've missed something important. "My understanding," Fawcett said carefully, "is that she is the respondent in this case, Your Honor. Judge Beaulieu didn't smile. No, he said quietly. That's not what I asked. The courtroom stayed silent. Behind me, someone whispered. My mother leaned forward. My father frowned, clearly annoyed that the hearing had taken a strange turn. Judge Beaulieu picked up one of the documents from the stack the clerk had passed him. He tapped the paper once with his pen. Counsel, he said again. Before presenting arguments about a person's character, it's generally wise to understand who that person is. Fawcett cleared his throat. Well, Your Honor, if there's something relevant to the proceedings. There is, the judge said. He turned the paper around so Fawcett could see it. From where I sat, I already knew which page it was. The verification letter from the Department of National Defense, confirming my service record. Fawcett leaned forward to read it. The silence stretched long enough that people in the back of the gallery began shifting in their seats. Then his eyes widened. Just slightly. But enough. He straightened slowly. I was not aware, he said. Judge Beaulieu looked at him over the rim of his reading glasses. That's clear. My mother's face twisted in confusion. Your Honor, she said sharply. What does that have to do with anything? The judge didn't answer her right away. Instead, he turned his attention back to the room. Then he said something simple. Miss Aldridge served 6 years in the Canadian Armed Forces. The words filled the courtroom like the slow toll of a bell. For a moment, no one spoke. In a small Ontario town, especially one where Remembrance Day still shuts down the main street and veterans still stand in the cold outside the cenotaph every November, those words carried weight. You could feel it move through the room. A man near the back straightened in his seat. An older gentleman in a Legion blazer removed his poppy-pinned cap. My father blinked. My mother's mouth fell slightly open. She what? She said. Judge Beaulieu continued, his tone steady. According to the documentation provided, Miss Aldridge served overseas on operational deployments and received several commendations during her service, including strength of character recognition from her commanding officer. He set the paper down again. I don't typically comment on personal matters in an estates dispute, he added. But when someone's character is being questioned publicly, context matters. The courtroom remained quiet. My parents stared at me like they were looking at a stranger. And in a way they were. Because they had never asked. Not once in 7 years. My father leaned forward slowly. You were in the military? His voice wasn't angry, just confused. Lost. I nodded once. Yes. My mother shook her head, disbelief across her face. That can't be right, she said. You never told us. I kept my voice calm. You never asked. Those 3 words seemed to hit harder than anything else said that morning. My mother sat back in her chair. My father rubbed his jaw. Fawcett cleared his throat, trying to regain control. Your Honor, he said, while military service is certainly admirable, I fail to see how it changes the matter of the estate. Judge Beaulieu nodded slightly. You're correct, he said. Service alone does not determine inheritance. He paused. But it does challenge the narrative that Miss Aldridge is, what was the phrase used earlier? His eyes moved toward my mother. A disappointment. My mother's face flushed red. I didn't mean. The judge raised a hand gently. This court isn't here to referee family insults, he said. He looked back down at the documents. However, he continued, it is clear that the picture presented earlier was incomplete. Fawcett shifted his weight. My clients were unaware of this information, he said quickly. That's precisely the point, the judge replied. He looked at me again. Miss Aldridge, he said. Why was this not raised earlier? I thought about the question. The answer was simple. Because I didn't think it mattered, I said. And it didn't. I hadn't returned to Lanark County to impress anyone. I came because my grandmother asked me to, in the only way she could, through a will. The judge studied me quietly. Then he nodded once. That's fair. Behind me, someone murmured something I couldn't quite make out. I didn't turn around, but I felt something warm stir in my chest. The quiet recognition of strangers who understood more than my own parents did. Judge Beaulieu straightened the stack of papers and looked at both tables. All right, he said. Let's return to the matter at hand. But the tone of the room had changed. People no longer looked at me like a stranger who had come back for a house. They looked at my parents, and something in their expressions said the same question was forming in every mind. How could they not know? My father leaned toward my mother and whispered something I couldn't hear. She shook her head slowly, still stunned. The truth was, my service didn't change the will. It didn't magically resolve the case. But it changed something else. It exposed a deeper problem. Because when a parent doesn't even know the basic facts of their child's life, the courtroom starts asking questions no legal document can answer. Judge Beaulieu looked at the clock on the wall. "We'll take a short recess," he said. 15 minutes. The gavel tapped once. People began murmuring immediately. Chairs scraped the floor. Veterans in the room nodded respectfully in my direction as they stood. I remained seated. Across the aisle, my parents sat frozen, as if the ground beneath their certainty had just cracked open, and the real conversation hadn't even started yet. When the judge called for a recess, the courtroom loosened like a window finally pushed open after a long winter. People stood, stretched, whispered. In a small town, 15 minutes is more than enough time for a story to circle the room twice. I stayed where I was. My hands rested on the table, fingers folded the way they had been trained to rest during briefings years ago. Old habits don't leave when the uniform comes off. A man in his 70s walked slowly past my table. He wore a faded blazer with a Royal Canadian Legion crest on the breast pocket. He paused beside me. "Forces?" he asked quietly. "Yes, sir." He nodded once. "Thank you for your service." "Thank you for yours," I replied. Then he moved on. It wasn't dramatic. Just a quiet exchange between two people who understood something the rest of the room didn't. Across the aisle, my parents hadn't moved. My father leaned toward my mother, speaking in low tones. She kept shaking her head, her expression caught somewhere between confusion and something I couldn't quite name. Maybe regret, maybe disbelief, maybe the slow realization that they had spent years telling a story about me that no longer made sense. Fawcett stood beside them, whispering quickly. His polished confidence had faded. He glanced at me once, then looked away. He had built his entire argument around a version of who I was supposed to be. Now that version had cracked. 15 minutes later, the clerk called everyone back. Judge Beaulieu returned, adjusted his papers, and said, "Let's continue." His voice was steady. But something in the room had shifted. Before the recess, people had been curious. Now they were paying attention. "Mr. Fawcett," the judge said, "you may proceed with any further arguments." Fawcett stood again, but this time his tone was more measured. "Your Honor," he said, "while the court has learned new information about Miss Aldridge's background, the legal matter remains unchanged. The question before the court is whether the property transfer was influenced unfairly." Judge Beaulieu nodded. "And your evidence for that claim?" Fawcett hesitated. "Well, my clients believe." The judge interrupted gently. "Belief is not evidence." The room went quiet again. Fawcett adjusted his tie. "In that case, Your Honor, I would ask the court to consider the broader circumstances of the family relationship." The judge turned toward me. "Miss Aldridge," he said, "would you like to address the court before I review the final materials?" I stood again. My chair slid softly against the floor. For the first time that morning, I looked directly at my parents. They looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, but in certainty. "My grandmother and I spoke often," I said calmly. "Not every week, but when we could." My mother scoffed. "That's not true." I didn't react. "I sent her letters," I continued, "and money when she needed help with groceries or repairs." The judge flipped through the documents. "I see several electronic transfers here," he said. My father frowned. "She never told us about any of that." I met his eyes briefly. "She asked me not to." My mother's voice rose. "Why would she do that?" I answered honestly. "Because she didn't want you to think I was trying to prove something." The judge leaned back slightly. "And why did she leave the house to you?" he asked. I thought about that carefully. The answer wasn't legal. It was personal. "Because she believed I would take care of it," I said. Fawcett folded his arms. "Your Honor, with respect, emotional statements don't determine estate law." "That's correct," Judge Beaulieu said. He looked down at the will, which is why we look at written intent. He tapped the page gently. "The will is clear." He paused long enough that everyone in the courtroom leaned forward. "Elise Aldridge left the property to her granddaughter, Maren Aldridge." My mother stood abruptly. "That's not fair," she said. The clerk stepped forward. "Ma'am." Judge Beaulieu lifted a hand. "Mrs. Aldridge," he said calmly, "I understand this is difficult, but it's wrong," she insisted. We were the ones there every day. The judge nodded. That may be true, he said. But presence alone does not override written testamentary intent. My father stood beside her. So that's it, he said. She just takes it. The judge looked at both of them for a long moment. Then he said something unexpected. This case isn't really about the house, is it? No one answered. He continued. It's about years of resentment that finally reached a courtroom. The room stayed silent. Judge Beaulieu looked at me, then back at my parents. Your daughter served this country for 6 years, he said. She returned quietly. She has not insulted you in this courtroom. He folded his hands together. That says something about character. My parents didn't respond. They stared at the floor. The court will uphold the will as written, the judge said. The gavel tapped once. The property belongs to Miss Aldridge. That should have felt like a victory, but it didn't. Not really. Because justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's simply standing still while the truth catches up to the people who spent years running from it. As the courtroom began to empty, I gathered my papers slowly. Across the aisle, my parents remained seated. For the first time in years, they looked unsure of what to say to me. And that uncertainty was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. When the courtroom emptied, the noise faded slowly. People shuffled toward the hallway. Chairs scraped the wooden floor. A few voices murmured polite goodbyes. I stayed for a moment, letting the room settle. Across the aisle, my parents were still in their seats. My mother stared at the floor. My father's hands were folded tightly together. Their lawyer leaned down, said something quiet, patted my father on the shoulder, and left the room. And then it was the three of us. No lawyers, no judge. Just a family that hadn't known how to speak to each other in years. I gathered my folder and stood. The instinct to leave was strong. That's what I had done the last time everything fell apart between us. I walked away before anyone could say something that couldn't be taken back. But something about the quiet in that room held me there. My father looked up first. His voice sounded rough. You were really in the forces? I nodded. Yes. He stared at me for a long moment, like he was trying to measure the distance between the daughter he remembered and the woman standing in front of him now. 6 years? He asked. Yes. My mother finally lifted her head. You never told us, she said again. But this time her voice didn't carry the same accusation. It sounded smaller, tired. You never asked, I replied gently. The words weren't meant to wound. They were simply the truth. My father rubbed the back of his neck, a habit he'd had since I was a child, whenever he ran out of things to say. Well, he muttered. I guess we didn't. Nobody spoke for a few seconds. Then my mother said something I didn't expect. Were you overseas? I nodded. A few times. Her eyes widened slightly, and we didn't even know. That realization seemed to land on both of them at the same time. Years had passed, things had happened. Danger, distance, deployments. And they hadn't known any of it. Not because I had hidden it, but because we had stopped talking long before those years began. My father stood slowly. For a moment I thought he might say something defensive. Instead, he looked around the empty courtroom and said, This whole thing was a mistake. My mother turned toward him. What do you mean? He gestured toward the door the judge had exited through, dragging our daughter into court over a house. The word daughter sounded unfamiliar coming from him, like he hadn't used it in a long time. My mother's shoulders sank. I just thought she didn't care about us anymore, she said. I stepped closer. I did care, I said. But every time we talked before I left, it turned into an argument. My father nodded slowly. That's true. He glanced at me. You always wanted to do things your own way. Yes, I said. And that scared you. He didn't deny it. For a long moment, the three of us stood there in the quiet courtroom. The anger that had fueled this entire case suddenly felt smaller than the years we had lost. Finally, my mother asked, What are you going to do with the house? I thought about the little farmhouse on the concession road, the creaky porch, the sugar maple my grandmother used to sit beneath on warm afternoons. I'm going to fix it up, I said. My father nodded once. It needs it. We all knew that was true. The roof probably needed reshingling. The porch railing had started to lean. My grandmother had managed as long as she could, but the house had aged with her. My father shifted his weight and cleared his throat. If you need a hand with the roof, he said, I still know a thing or two about shingles. I studied his face. He wasn't offering to control anything. He was offering because he didn't know how else to reach across the distance between us. That would be nice, I said. My mother looked relieved just hearing that. She stood and picked up her purse. I suppose, she said hesitantly, we should come by sometime. You're welcome to, I replied. Not a grand invitation. Just a simple one. The kind that leaves space for trust to grow again. We walked out of the courthouse together. The afternoon sun had warmed the stone steps. A few townspeople lingered across the street near the cenotaph, pretending not to watch. Small towns don't change overnight, but sometimes the way people look at you does. My father paused beside his truck. Well, he said, guess we'll see you around. I nodded. Yeah, I said. Guess you will. As they drove away, I stood there for a minute longer. The courthouse behind me, the quiet street in front of me, and somewhere beyond the edge of town, my grandmother's farmhouse, waiting for a new chapter. The case had ended, but something else had just begun. Something slower. Something harder. Learning how to be a family again. The first Sunday after the hearing was colder than the week before. November in eastern Ontario doesn't ease into winter. It arrives like a door swung open. One day the maples are golden, and the next morning there's frost on the windshield and your breath hangs in the air the moment you step outside. I was standing on a ladder beside the farmhouse, pulling away old shingles, when I heard the sound of tires on gravel. I didn't need to look. My father's Ford had a rattle in the exhaust you could hear from half a concession away. I climbed down slowly and wiped my hands on a rag. They parked near the barn. For a moment, neither of them got out. Then the passenger door opened. My mother stepped out first, holding a covered dish. Some things never change. Sunday meals in our family had always meant someone carrying food. My father followed, walking toward the house with that same steady stride he'd had my whole life. He looked up at the roof and nodded. Those shingles are about 10 years past done, he said. I smiled a little. That's why I started replacing them. He walked closer, studied the ladder, the stack of shingles, the tools laid out in the grass. You can't finish that alone, he said. I know. He nodded once. Good. Then he reached into the bed of his truck and pulled out a toolbox. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No speeches. No apology yet. Just a man opening a toolbox and climbing a ladder. My mother stood in the yard watching us for a minute before walking up the porch steps. I'll put this in the kitchen, she said quietly. The screen door creaked the same way it always had. Inside that house, the floors still carried the soft squeak of decades of footsteps. The smell of coffee and cinnamon drifted out a few minutes later. My father and I worked side by side most of the morning, replacing shingles, checking the boards underneath, hammering nails into old wood that had seen more seasons than any of us. At first, we didn't talk much. But working together has a way of loosening words the way nothing else can. 6 years, my father said finally, passing me another shingle. That's a long time. Yes, it is. He nodded slowly. You must have seen a lot. I thought about the places I had been. Desert heat. Cold rain on the tarmac at Trenton. Long nights on base when Canada felt like a different planet entirely. Some things, I said. He didn't push for details. Maybe he understood that some stories need time. Around noon, my mother called from the porch. Lunch is ready. We climbed down and washed up at the outdoor tap, the way we used to after yard work when I was a kid. The three of us sat around my grandmother's kitchen table, the same table where she used to drink tea and tell stories about what the town had been like 50 years ago. For a while, we just ate. Then my mother set her fork down. Maren, she said carefully. I looked up. Her eyes were red, like she'd been turning something over in her mind for a long time. I shouldn't have called you a disappointment, she said. The words came out slowly. Each one seemed to push past pride to get free. My father nodded beside her. That wasn't right, he said. I sat there for a moment, letting the silence settle around the table. You were angry, I said. Yes, my mother admitted, but that doesn't excuse it. My father cleared his throat. We didn't understand you, he said. And instead of asking questions, we made assumptions. I nodded. That happens in a lot of families. My mother looked down at the table. I was afraid, she said quietly. Afraid of what? That you left because I failed you. The room went still. Sometimes the truth hiding underneath anger is much simpler than the anger itself. I didn't leave because you failed me, I said. I left because I needed to figure out who I was. My father leaned back in his chair. That takes courage, he said. Coming from him, that meant more than I expected. After lunch, we sat on the porch. The sugar maple in the yard had dropped its last leaves. A cold wind moved through the bare branches. My father looked out at the fields for a long time before speaking again. "You know," he said, "families used to settle things on porches like this. Before lawyers," my mother added. I smiled faintly. Maybe we're just late. We sat there quietly for a while, not fixing everything, just starting. Before they left that afternoon, my father turned back toward the house. "We'll come by next Sunday," he said. "If that's all right." "It is," I replied. And I meant it. Because sometimes reconciliation doesn't arrive in one moment. It arrives in small steps, shared meals, repaired roofs, conversations that finally happen after years of silence. So if you're listening to this and it reminds you of someone in your own family, maybe a daughter, maybe a son, maybe someone you haven't spoken to in years, I hope you remember something my grandmother once told me. People aren't always who you think they are. Sometimes they're stronger than you ever realized. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you believe families deserve second chances, stay with us for more stories like this. Because sometimes the quietest voices carry the strongest truths.